Hello everyone and welcome back to my channel. Today I'm going over my fifth and final game from my tournament at the Midwest Class Championship. So in round 5, the pattern thus far has been in round 1, play a 12-year-old, round 2, 16-year-old, round 3, 12-year-old, round 4, 16-year-old, and the pattern held up. Round 5, back to a 12-year-old, playing the young and talented Anshul P. Shetty. Who I believe is rated around 2100. Forgot to add that to my study here, but life goes on. And in this game, I have 2.5 points out of 4, so I'm +1 in the tournament. And it's looking like if I win this last round, I will be in the money. So a lot to play for here, but it is the evening round on the last round of the weekend. And again, I was operating on 4 hours sleep for this final day due to some unfortunate goings on in my hotel, but we ain't got to talk about it. Okay, so d4, knight f6 by the young Anshul. I go c4, g6, knight c3, d5, captures, e4, knight c3, bc3, bishop g7, and I choose the bishop c4 line of the Grunfeld, one of the main variations. Now my opponent goes c5, I go knight to e2. This is the idea of putting the bishop on c4 rather than e2. We preserve this square for the knight, and now, as we will see momentarily, after castles, if black chooses to put this bishop on g4, we're not obligated to give up our knight, which controls the dark squares in the center, for this light squared controlling bishop, because we will have the option of playing f3. Sort of the point of this line for white. Now, black can do any number of things. Bishop g4 is still a very decent move, and after f3, there are a couple really well-discussed theoretical lines. In this game, my opponent chose a bit of a sideline with b6. I call it a sideline. It's a perfectly fine line, but it's just not seen as much as the main moves, queen c7, knight a5, bishop g4. These moves are all just a little bit more common. So b6 by my opponent. So now I come with rook to c1. This is almost always a very useful move for white in the Grunfeld. We're anticipating the opening up of the c-file, and knight a5 by black is a very common maneuver, trying to invade on the c4 square. So the rook very well placed on c1 in many variations. My opponent plays bishop to b7, and here I was not super familiar with all of the theory, but I chose queen to d2. Another very useful move for white. Clears the d1 square if we need it for our rook, and also threatens to go bishop h6, trying to get rid of our opponent's best minor piece. And now, from what I did know about these positions, I knew that black almost always plays this move e6. And I suspect the reason why is because white is very often going to try to play this move d5 in this structure. Just gaining some extra space and trying to open the way for the pieces. So, black doesn't have to do this right away. You can do something like maybe rook c8, rook fd1, but usually this move e6 ends up coming on the board. And in the game, my opponent chose c takes d4, and now, okay, I wasn't super familiar with the position before. This move does pretty much take us out of theoretical territory, and I was sort of playing on my own. But okay, this next move is not hard. Opponent took our pawn. We'll take back. Now my opponent plays knight to a5. Again, not a super difficult move. This is attacked. This is attacked. Bishop d3. Solve all the problems. And now queen to d7. So the question here is, how do we continue with white? Our opponent has avoided playing this move, pawn to e6. So does that mean we should immediately play d5 without thinking? Hopefully you should say no. If I ever say, is the idea do this without thinking? Generally, the idea is always that's incorrect. Thinking is powerful in chess. So d5 should be one of the moves we're considering, though. And what should we be considering in the event of d5? Well, if our opponent lets this pawn stand, I do think we're going to get some sort of edge by taking over this central d4 square. This is why we really want to play this d5 move. Yes, it makes sense to try to stunt this bishop, but more so it's about giving our pieces more space to work with, more space to try to come and invade. So what's the big advantage of having this d4 square? Well, maybe I can bring my bishop here, trade off your active minor piece. Maybe I can bring my knight here, eye some very important squares in black's camp and get some activity. Not hard to understand why this would be good for white. Now, what is the downside? Well, the downside is always when you push pawns is they can become targets. So I shied away from d5 in this initial position here because of this move e6. I don't think I'm going to be able to hold on to this pawn on the d5 square. If I play something like knight to f4, I think black can and should just go ahead and chop, 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 win a pawn. Not so fun for white. So I would have to play d takes e6, and this would be okay. If you watched my round 3 game, you'll remember I spoke a little bit about having this 4v3 type of structure, how it can be a little bit advantageous for the side with the 4v3 rather than the 2v1 on the queen side, but in reality it's not a whole lot. So I decided I would keep d5 in my back pocket for now, not go d5 yet. Okay, so with that out of the way, what do we do? Well, we had an idea with queen to d2. Opponent didn't really stop us, so I saw no reason not to continue with bishop to h6. Here my opponent plays rook f to c8. Now this bishop is threatening to take on d4. I don't know if it's a good idea, but it's a threat. And I want to trade these guys off anyways, so bishop takes g7 is my choice. King takes g7. Now the question is what to do from here with white. So of course we should return to this d5 idea. This should be one of our ideas in pretty much every position. So we should look at this again. And other than that, there are various other improving moves we could try. The move queen to e3 came to mind. The move queen to b2 came to mind. And something that you might not expect at first blush, but the move f4 I was toying around with. And okay, as always, gotta be on the lookout for h4 in these positions in the Grunfeld. They tend to be doing this in every position. So how do we sort of sift through all of these moves? Well, I eliminated this move f4 kind of first. This one I just didn't think was quite as good of an idea because after f5, I really don't want to play this move e5 because queen d5 is going to just ruin my day. Now, it gets rather complicated after stuff like e takes f5, stuff like d5, but I wasn't so interested in going for this. I thought I could do better. So other than that, moves like queen f4, queen e3 also seemed quite nice. And I very nearly did play this move h4. What I was worried about is this queen coming to g4 when I didn't really see a great response for white. Now it turns out queen to g5 is going to be a good idea. And this was something that I just sort of underestimated for white. This endgame is sort of torture for black. This structure is very, very good for white. You might not expect it with the doubled pawns, but this pawn just hugely cramps black's king and cramps black's king side. And this 5v4 is potentially even more advantageous than a 4v3. Tends to be the way these kingside majorities work. 3v2, it's not so bad for black. 4v3 is a little bit better for white. 5v4 can get quite dangerous. Mostly in rook endgames, but also in other endgames as well. So h4 I think was a very decent idea. d5 as well turns out to be a very, very nice move. After e6, we can go knight f4. Takes, for example, takes. And the difference here is that you're not so comfortable playing bishop takes d5 thanks to bishop e4 winning a piece. Good enough. So knight f4, this resource is enough to keep my pawn on d5. And if I can keep this pawn on d5, d5 is probably worth playing. So rather than all of that, I actually chose the move queen to b2, which is a bit of a mistake. It sort of takes my foot off the gas a little bit. D5 was better. And in actuality, all of these moves that I was considering that weren't queen b2, turns out they give white a much bigger advantage than queen b2 does. So this was my big mistake in the game, queen b2, when I should have been more directly focused on either playing d5 or launching this kingside initiative, f4, h4, this kind of thing, would have been the better way to go for white here. Instead, queen b2, trying to prepare this move d5 a little bit, but my opponent plays king to g8, a very decent move. And now I do go ahead and play d5, and the reason I chose this slightly strange order of doing things is after the move e6, I saw I could play this idea of bishop to b5. And this is what made me go for this line. As it turns out, though, black is able to equalize. After queen to d6, queen to f6. Here I fully expected my opponent to go queen to d8, and the more I looked at it, the less thrilled I actually was. So what I had calculated is takes, takes, and after takes, takes, I thought that with this structure, potentially I would have some kind of advantage. It turns out, though, black is just a little bit too active here. With the bishop on b7 and the rook coming into d2, it's enough for full equality for black. There's really no edge here at all for white. My pieces are just a little bit too awkward to really prove anything in this position. Now, my opponent potentially overestimated my position after queen to d8, because he went absolutely psycho here and played queen to b4, which maybe this is a symptom of it being the last round. And, you know, I think everybody has this problem where I think everybody struggles to focus a bit more in the final round. You know, you just want to get your tournament over with. You want to go home. You want to be done. But queen b4 is sort of inexcusable. So everything is wonderful for black if I have to respect this threat to my bishop and I have to move it out of the way. Then black is doing great. You can take this d5 pawn. You're winning a pawn. Life is amazing. You're winning the game. But of course, that's just not going to happen, right? I just go d takes e6, and black is more or less checkmated by force. So see if you can find the win after queen takes b5. Go ahead and take a moment. Okay, of course, the idea is e takes f7, king f8, and now knight f4 makes two threats at the same time, which is impossible for black to deal with. Same thing happens after queen takes e4, threatening checkmate. We'll take here with check, and now knight f4 doesn't attack the queen, but it defends checkmate and threatens knight to e6. And again, this is just an impossible threat for black to deal with. You can do this. But amongst other moves, I have things like rook to e1 here with rook to e8 to follow. Just disaster. So my opponent comes up with a way to try to survive. Goes rook takes c1, take on f7 with check first, take back with the rook. After rook to c8, really any move wins for white. I chose rook to d1. Opponent goes queen e7. I take, rook d7 check, knight d4 check, f3. And okay, this position is just hopeless for black. The absolute best case scenario is that you pick up this f7 pawn and then you play an endgame, which is just objectively lost, down a full pawn with a very strong e pawn for white. But you don't actually get there. He chose a6, I go bishop d3. And after bishop to c6, I just go rook to c7. If you take my guy, I go f8. If you move out of the way, I win a full piece. And my opponent decided to resign here, giving me one of the quickest victories of the tournament for me. So what happened? Things just collapsed right away. And it really just comes down to queen f6, queen b4. I think this was a symptom of some laziness at the board, which I'm going to claim is the #1 cause of game-losing blunders, is laziness at the board, whether or not you have a good position or a bad position. You just need to remain constantly vigilant in your chess games. That's the only way to avoid things like this happening to you. Other than that, pretty clean game. I found this position to be very interesting, though. I chose queen to b2, giving away most of my advantage, when really any of the other moves I was considering would have granted white nearly a +1 advantage. Just we're really crashing through here on the king's side with the way that black has played this position. So something to keep in mind in your Grunfeld games. Don't underestimate these kingside attacks. They can oftentimes be quite good for white. Okay. With that, I'm going to try to keep this video under 25 minutes for once in my life. Thank you all so much for watching. Oh, I almost forgot. Yeah, I ended up winning money in this tournament. With this victory, I tied for some overall place, but the prize I won was under 2,300, first, tied for first, and I got 400 bucks. So paid for the weekend up in Wheeling. Thankful for that. Glad to be winning some stuff. Not so bad. Thank you all so much for watching. So my name is Caleb Denby, and I will see you all next time.